A beggar had been sitting by the side of the road for over 30 years. One day a stranger walked by. "Spare some change," mumbled the beggar, mechanically holding out his old baseball cap. "I have nothing to give you," said the stranger. Then he asked, "What's that you're sitting on?" "Nothing," replied the beggar. "Just an old box. I have been sitting on it for as long as I can remember." "Ever looked inside?" asked the stranger. "No," said the beggar. "What's the point? There's nothing in there." "Have a look inside," insisted the stranger. The beggar decided to give it a try and managed to pry open the lid. With astonishment, disbelief, and elation, he saw that the box was filled with gold. Hi, this is Darren with Philosophize Now. So today we'll be looking at the review and summary of The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. So in the parable that you just heard, Eckhart Tolle says that we are like the beggar in this parable, and that the wealth is actually inside ourselves, not inside any box, and that this wealth is far greater than any gold or money. And what is this wealth? Well, inside every one of us is a radiant joy of being and an unshakable peace that comes with it. And many have termed this state enlightenment. So if any of this interests you, keep watching. We'll first start by looking at a review of the book, and then we're going to look at the summary of the book. Please feel free to use timestamps to get to the section you would like to watch. So next we'll look at the review of this book. First we'll start with the positives, and then we'll look at the negatives. So the positives of this book. Firstly, the concept is very simple and can actually be explained in only a few pages. The rest of the book is used to explain other questions that arise when trying to follow this concept. Secondly, it's an easy read as he uses a conversational style of writing in the text. Thirdly, he uses a question and answer format. And I personally quite like this, as many of the common questions that you come about get answered in later chapters. And this happened to me where I had a few questions that were answered in later pages. And with this question and answer format, he also then gives lots of practical advice, because as he explains a concept, invariably a reader asks a question on how to apply this concept, and then he goes into explanation, giving the practical way of applying his concepts. And the fifth point is that he uses pauses in the book. So whenever he talks about an important concept, he puts a pause at the end of the concept to allow the reader time to fully accept and understand what has just been said, which is really nice to have these reminders to stop and actually take in what you've just read. And then now let's move on to the negatives. So the first negative I came across was that sometimes he can seem a bit condescending when certain readers ask the same question multiple times. And secondly, he mentions small parts of other religious texts to try strengthen his ideas. But I personally think it does the opposite of this, as if you take a small part of any text, you lose the context in which it was written, and therefore you can manipulate the actual meaning. So would I read this book? I'd have to say yes, as I feel it had a lot to offer, especially because it had so much practical advice, which allows one to implement the concepts much easier. So now let's move on to the summary of this book. So he starts the book by telling his own personal story and how he discovered the power of now, which basically is through his own intense suffering. And then he begins explaining what the power of now is. And as we mentioned earlier, he calls this enlightenment. But what that word enlightenment often conjures up is an idea of some superhuman accomplishment. But this is not true. It is your natural state of being. It is the connectiveness with something immeasurable and indestructible. Something that is paradoxically you, but also much greater than you. And this is deep within every life form as their true nature. We can also refer to this as being. But this concept cannot be understood or grasped by the mind. Being can only be felt. So now let's move on to the first practical exercise, so that we can try and feel what he's talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to go deeply into our body. So what you need to do first is to sit down in any manner that you like. The only thing that is important is to keep your spine erect. Then I want you to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths into your lower abdomen, keeping your attention on the sensation of the stomach expanding and contracting. Once you have done this, move your attention to your body's inner energy field. Don't think about it, Just feel it. And then try to drop any mental image you have of the physical body. All that should be left now is that feeling of presence. So now move deeper into this feeling. And as you move deeper, this distinction between the inner and the outer body should dissolve. Once this is achieved, you are now in the realm of being. But don't worry if you cannot get through all these steps at first, as this may take time to master. So now that you know the core concept, now let's move on to the obstacles that may arise when one is trying to stay in this state of being. And the first and greatest obstacle, according to Eckhart Tolle, is our identification with the mind, which creates excessive thinking. Now, why is this a problem? Well, the problem is not in thinking, but in the amount of thinking. Just like everything else which is done excessively, for instance, eating too much food. Eating food is vital for our survival, but eating too much is likely to lead to many problems such as obesity, heart attacks, or strokes. And therefore, we should use thinking as a tool when we need it and then put it away for the rest of the time. And secondly, it also creates an opaque screen of concepts, labels, and judgments, which comes between us and all relationships, which prevents us from having true relationships and creates the illusion of separateness from all things. And then thirdly, the mind is also responsible for judging all of your actions and causes misery and unhappiness through these judgments. So how do we go about fixing this? The first step is in realizing that you are not the mind, and then this allows you to watch what we call the thinker. This is the part of the mind that does all the thinking. So the first step involves consciously listening to the voice inside your head and observing any common thought patterns. The next step involves watching your thoughts with the awareness of this new dimension of consciousness that allows you to separate yourself from these thoughts. And while you are watching your thoughts in this way, they will begin to disappear as they are not receiving any energy anymore. And over time, as you practice, you will start to notice periods of stillness occurring between thoughts. And this is the state of being. And with time, this sense of stillness and peace will deepen, and the subtle joy of being will start to show itself. Next, we'll move on to the second obstacle he identifies, and this is emotions and pain. So why is this a problem? Well, because all emotions are a type of disturbance, and they are not our true nature. Our true nature is the true peace, joy, and love, and these are not emotions, but our natural state of being. And most people confuse these states with the lesser emotions. They confuse pleasure with joy, desire with love. And the best way to know if it is an emotion or a natural state of being is by identifying the source of the feeling. Emotions have a cause outside oneself, whereas the true states of being come from within. And all emotional pain comes from the non-acceptance of the present moment. And this could be from a judgment or thought which creates the negativity. And every emotional pain leaves a residue which merges with other pain from the past. And this forms what Eckhart Tolle calls the pain body, which is a separate part of you. And signs of the pain body are irritation, bad moods, and fighting with others for no reason. So how do we go about fixing this? Well, the first step is by being present and observing the pain body. This takes away the energy it needs to thrive. And then when an emotion such as anger does arise, do not judge or think about it. Just observe it and become aware of not only the emotional pain, but also of the one who observes, and see what happens to this emotion. And what should happen is it should disappear in the same manner as thoughts, as it is not receiving energy from you anymore. And thus you will not be adding to your pain body anymore. And then the third obstacle he mentions is time. So why is time a problem? Well, as time and the mind are inseparable, one cannot exist without the other. And the only time is now. The past is memories of a previous now, and the future is our projection of what the now will become. But both are only pale imitations of the true now. And often our negativity is caused by the accumulation of psychological time. This is seen in symptoms such as unease, anxiety, tension, stress, or worry. You may believe that all your suffering is caused by specific situations in your life, but the true root of your suffering lies in your attachment to the past or future. Let's use an example from my own life. So over the Christmas period, I was lucky and got to spend some time with my family. And with one family member, I had a disagreement about their behavior, and we had an argument. Now after the argument, I felt bad for how I had reacted, as I knew there was a better way to handle this situation. And this caused me suffering in that I felt both unhappy and regret around this situation. So now we can see that my current suffering is caused because of my attachment to this past situation. And if I accept what had happened, and that I cannot change the past, and rather focus on the present moment and ensuring that this doesn't happen in the present moment, this would help alleviate my suffering. And then the final point he makes is that your problems today are not the same as your problems of the past. So even if all your problems were solved today, new ones would arise. So how do we end the delusion of time and the suffering with it? Well, the first step is to empty your mind. Don't judge or label what you see or hear or feel. Accept the moment as it is. The second step is to make the present moment the primary focus of your life, so that you spend less time in the past and the future, and thus create less psychological time and pain. And once this is achieved, you'll need to learn how to use clock time, and this will be for the practical aspects of your life, such as planning appointments, learning from the past, and setting goals for the future. And one example of how you would know if you're using time correctly is learning from a mistake is using clock time. But if you dwell on the mistake and criticize yourself, this is using psychological time. But don't be frustrated if you notice negativity has arisen inside of you. Mark it not as a failure, but as a reminder to wake up and become present once more, thus using it as a tool to grow. So those were the 3 main obstacles he talks about in the book. Next, we'll look at 2 other important concepts that he also talks about, but aren't really obstacles. The first one is negative situations. So if you find yourself stuck in a negative situation, the first step is to ask yourself, can the situation be improved or changed? If the answer is yes, then take the action needed. Even if this action is just planning the steps required to remove yourself from the situation. If the answer to the question was no and you cannot change the situation, he suggests to move more deeply into the now until the change happens naturally, or the situation changes and you can now take action, and then take action. And then the second important concept is around life purpose. And what someone asked Eckhart is, doesn't life need a purpose? Otherwise we would just drift along. But a purpose implies future. And what Eckhart replied is, when you are on a journey, it is certainly helpful to know where you are going. But your life purpose has 2 aspects. One is the inner purpose and the other, the outer purpose. So your outer purpose might be to achieve some goal, which does imply future. But if you focus too much on the outer purpose, you will miss your inner purpose, which has nothing to do with what is going on outside or what you are doing, but is entirely focused on how you are doing it, the quality of your consciousness in the present moment. And then the third and final concept is around surrendering or accepting the present moment. And what one person asks Eckhart is, if I surrender and accept all things as they are, then I will have no use for improving anything in my personal life or in society in general. And without our drive to improve our situation, we would still be living in caves. And Eckhart replies that this type of surrender that he refers to is not that which involves giving up or defeat. It involves the profound wisdom of yielding to rather than opposing the flow of life. And this is purely an inner change, and one can still take action and bring about change in the outer world. When one has completely surrendered, you will be able to clearly see what needs to be done and when action must be taken. And that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.